Hello and welcome to part 2 of our education series on Engage with Eagle Forum. I'm Glyn McKay, a board member of Eagle Forum, and I'm joined by our political director, Tabitha.
Hi, everyone. In part 1, we introduced you to 2 educators, Natasha, who is a public school principal, and Frances, who homeschooled her children. If you are a parent, you may currently be deciding the best method of education for your child this fall. So we wanted to present you with 2 of those options. If you haven't listened to it yet, we encourage you to do so.
So now we want to follow up with some of the big decisions being made by our elected officials and talk about the rights that parents already have. So joining us in that discussion today is James Rice. James is the legislative director for U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, for whom he has worked since June 2000. That's 20 years, James. That's awesome. So in this role, James serves as the chief advisor to Senator Grassley on foreign policy and education matters, as well as overseeing his legislative staff. James' previous professional experience includes positions in the Iowa Senate, an internship with the British Conservative Party, and work on various political campaigns. James received a BA from Drake University with majors in political science and history and an MA in statecraft and international affairs from the Institute of World Politics. He is a native of Davenport, Iowa. James, you have been such a great friend of Eagle Forum for a long time, and we're always grateful for your insight and knowledge on legislative issues. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure, I'm glad to be here.
Well, first, there's a lot of noise in the media, in both the mainstream and social media, surrounding education and what school's going to look like in the fall. There are so many voices in the mix, from elected officials to agency heads to talking heads. So James, will you cut through all that noise and give us the inside scoop? What is actually going on in DC on education?
Well, in DC, of course, there's the national discussion about reopening schools. And at the end of the day, that's going to be a local decision made by local school districts, local schools, and of course, parents. But at the national level, there's a bill being introduced in the Senate today that is going to have funding for schools. And half of that money is specifically for schools that are going to bear extra costs because they're having in-person instruction. But again, it's ultimately a local decision, but schools that are going to be offering in-person instruction presumably are going to have larger costs. And so that's the policy thinking behind at least the Senate Republican proposal.
So a big question that I have is, what is the federal government's role in all this? Should parents even look to Congress for a fix?
No, I honestly don't think they should look to Congress. I think this whole pandemic has brought a lot more parents to more involved in their child's education. There are people who are sending their kids to school that are now having to help them with online learning, and they're getting to see what they're sit in on maybe a lesson plan for the first time, or they're getting to see what's taught and how it's taught, and they're helping their kids to learn. And so I think it's resulting in more parents being more engaged in their children's education, which is a great thing. Senator Grassley always talks about how it's really important that parents be fully engaged in their child's education. And I think it's also going to result in more demand by parents to have more options at the local level. Not every family is going to need the same thing. Communities are different, but even within a community, different families are going to need different things. And sometimes even within a family, even before this pandemic, I had visited some online public schools in Iowa, which is it's school districts in Iowa that offered an all online version. And because in Iowa, you can open enroll from one school district to another, people anywhere in Iowa could choose to go to one of these 2 online schools. And I met one family that had one kid that was just not doing well in the regular public school. And everything that the school tried to do to adjust the education to meet his needs didn't work. They found this online school, and he's thriving. He's several grade levels ahead, I think, in math or something, because you can work at your own pace on these. But then his brother still goes to the regular public school. And so even within that family, there was different needs. And so I think, you're going to see some parents that really need their kids back in school. My niece they found out her public school, she's going to be entering kindergarten, and they found out her public school was only offered 2 days a week, but she's extremely social. And of course, kindergarten is really hard to do off of distance learning. It's not really the same thing. And so they enrolled her in the local Christian school because it's offering 5 days a week. And so, this situation spurred them to take advantage of the choice that they had. And I think increasingly parents are going to demand more options. Maybe they want to do some classes online. I know another person who has a high school senior, and she's a great self-starter and she learns well online, and they're more comfortable having her continue to work online. And I don't know why we have to have a one-size-fits-all solution. And I'm hopefully that this situation will result in more parents demanding more options and more flexibility from their school options instead of a one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important that you highlighted the fact that, one, parents are engaging in more of their rights now, but also they are seeing firsthand of what their children are being taught, which is so important.
Yeah.
When you send your kids away to public school or even a private school that's a physical building, there's only so much a parent can be involved in. And so it's good to see parents have that firsthand look at their children's education.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned some of the financial fixes that are coming down the line in Congress. Can we talk about a few of those that may or may not be in the bill that you mentioned earlier? So financial relief through the federal government, what would that look like? What are some options that parents can expect or to even engage on?
The bill that's being introduced, it's basically additional funding beyond the normal federal funding to assist schools in reopening. The bill as proposed would have 10% of that go to help private schools because they are also having huge financial problems in terms of being able to reopen. But otherwise, other than that 10% of the funding, it would be split between funding that would go to all school districts and funding that would go to school districts specifically that have a reopening plan and need extra funding to make that effective. I've heard that Senator Scott is interested in expanding school choice options using federal funding. But of course, there's a limit to what the federal government can do in that school choice schooling is mostly a state and local issue. And so the most successful school choice options have been at the state and local level, and there's more scope for that. There isn't the constitutional authority to beyond simply allowing portability of federal funds. And of course, there has always been a principle of federal funds that the funding is to serve students. So the federal government doesn't fund public schools or private schools, they fund students. And so the main body of funding is for disadvantaged students, and it doesn't matter what school you go to, its services are available, and the same thing with disabled students. Those are kind of the two big pots of federal funding that go out on a normal basis, and they've always been intended to be directed towards students, not towards schools. This CARES package and the CARES 2 that we're sort of doing, these federal relief bills, are somewhat different in that they're focused on relief for schools themselves that have extra costs to a certain extent. But as far as parents' options, again, it does start at the local level. Parents should be going to school board meetings and saying what they expect from their school. They should be looking at what's available locally. They should be at the state level. There's a lot of states that have experimented with various types of choice options, and they should, those are the most impactful places. Heck, most people don't vote in school board elections. There's very low turnout, and so if you and some of your get together a bunch of parents who are concerned about something, you can have a major impact in the school board election.
When you were mentioning choice, and you mentioned your niece who's going to now go to a private kindergarten, I've seen lots of parents asking, well, what about, our tax dollars are going towards public schools. So is there any kind of talk about tax credit or anything like that for parents who might choose a method other than public school at this point?
There is always that discussion, and there are states that have that. Iowa has a tuition tax credit for people who go to private schools. There's other states that have scholarship tax credits so that you get a tax credit for donating to a private scholarship that then makes scholarships available. Fortunately, my niece is getting free tuition for the first year, but my brother is doing financial planning to try to make it work so they can keep her in that school going forward. But not everybody has that option. There's a lot of school choice available, and there's more available the more money you make. So if you have a good income, you can choose where to live, and you can move to the best school district. Or you can also afford to pay to go to private school. But if you don't have that kind of money, you have to live where you can afford to live, and you have to you don't have the resources to send your kid to a private school unless you have some kind of scholarship. So there's a discussion at all levels of government about those options, and less than 10% of all education funding comes from the federal government. So it's unlikely that you'll see a nationwide program. There's also limits in terms of what the federal government's constitutional authority is, or how much the federal government should get involved, because sometimes when the federal government does something, even with good intentions, eventually that it turns into something otherwise. And so, I think that is mostly a discussion for the state and local level.
So one of the bills that has been passed a couple times to renew this bill is called the SOAR Act, and that's a DC specific bill to allow students who live in the DC area to be able to pick the school of their choice based on a voucher. And so that means that the money would follow them wherever they go or wherever they choose, and it gives parents the opportunity to have a choice in their education. Now, it's a little controversial because it is a federal program. And so can you talk about the differences in ideology surrounding the voucher issue?
Sure. Well, first of all, that act is specific to DC because DC is unusual in that the U.S. Congress acts as effectively the state legislature for the District of Columbia because it's a federal district. And so DC Congress enacted that at the request of certain DC leaders as in its capacity essentially as the, if you will, state legislature for DC, not as a federal program per se. And it was at the request of certain DC leaders. And if you think about the District of Columbia, it has some of the greatest inequality of any place, and they've had terrible trouble with their public school quality. And after trying things again and again and again, eventually there's a sort of overwhelming demand for additional options. So DC has there was sort of three components. They put more money in there for the public school system, but they also created this DC Opportunity Scholarship Program so that low-income students had the option to go to private schools in the area. And they also built up the charter school network. And so there's quite a large network of charter schools in DC. So DC does have a lot of options now. And, you had a situation where you had very, very poor families in an extremely bad school environment that just wasn't improving. And this was something that was seen as necessary by both local people and Congress to bring people to give these families options that had no options. And it's sort of not fair to say, well, why don't you stay there and maybe we'll fix the school by the time your kid is out of the system. They needed an opportunities right away, and it's been very popular in DC. The scholarships are always oversubscribed, but it is something that people have an ideological aversion to. There's certainly opposition to having, the question is, does the money support the school system itself, or is it for the students? Is the goal of the government to make sure that all students have a good education, or is it to make sure they have the same education, or is it to support the school system itself? Of course, my belief, and Senator Grassi's belief, is that it's ultimately the parents' call. Their parent is the one who's responsible for their child's education. You can sort of outsource it, or you can take advantage of different school options, but at the end of the day, it's the parent's responsibility, and they should be able to choose what's best for their child, and as opposed to being told that this is the school that you have to send your child to, and there's no other options, even if it's the school is has poor quality and poor academic outcomes.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought up the inequality equation, part of this equation, because sometimes I feel like I'm living in two different worlds. I have friends saying you should be homeschooling your kids, and I have other people in my life who depend on school to provide security and safety for their children. And of course, we wish it wasn't like that, but that's the reality of the situation. It is not there is not an opportunity for probably the majority of Americans to homeschool their children. Because of a variety of situations. But anyway, I'm glad that Senator Grassley, especially, and many others in Washington are considering that all situations for so many families, and that they are adamant about leaving that to the states and localities.
And ultimately to the parents, because nobody should be telling you how best you should school your kid. Homeschool works great for some families and it doesn't for others, and what's best for your family, and nobody else does. So it should ultimately, there is no one right answer. And I think this is also true with this debate about school reopening. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game where you win or lose, you either open or you don't. Parents should get to decide what's best for their family and what form of education is best. Some kids really do need to be in a school setting, at least their parents believe so, and some kids are do fine in an online environment, or there's new ideas that have cropped up. I heard about there's parents that are getting together to sort of, there's already homeschool co-ops, but now there's people thinking about maybe hiring like private tutors to kind of like pool resources together to do that. Of course, not everybody can afford to do that.
Right.
And so that again, there has been a lot of discussion, I think, across the ideological spectrum about the fact that this situation has resulted in inequalities, or at least highlighted them, because some kids don't have, internet access at home. And so the idea of just moving to online, and you may have two parents that work and don't have jobs that they can work from home. So what do you do? And so there are kids that are missing out on education opportunities. That's not an easy nut to crack, but I think the solution always comes down to giving opportunities for parents, as opposed to somebody at any level of government deciding what should work best for everybody and what everyone should have to do.
Yeah. One more question on that. I just thought about this. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and some parents were talking with a pediatrician, and were saying, we keep hearing about, because of virtual learning, our kids are going to be behind. But what are they being behind? What are we talking about? And I remember when we were working on the Common Core issue, one of the points that we had was that the Common Core standards would result in our children being 2 years behind in, I believe it was math and science, their international counterparts. So is there discussion in DC? Is there a standard that Washington, that our federal government is looking at when we're talking about our children falling behind? What is that standard that we're talking about there? Do you have insight on that?
Well, there isn't a national standard, and shouldn't be. Common Core was an attempt to kind of create a de facto national standard. And one of the problems when you get back to the issue of parental control is that once every state joined, you couldn't change the standards unless every other state agreed. So you sort of locked it into it. And the idea is that parents should be able to should have some influence on what's being taught. And if you have one standard, even if you think it's great, and then you realize that some other country is doing it better, you don't want to make it so inflexible that you can't change that. So there were states like Massachusetts, I think, was famously had really high math standards and had to kind of water them down to meet the Common Core. There's always, when you're trying to pool everybody together, there's always going to be somewhat of a compromise on that. And so that's why it's best that these decisions are made as close to the parents as possible. Iowa was like the last state to, I think, adopt statewide content standards. They had them actually decided at the local school district level. Now we have statewide standards. But at least your state legislature is easier to get a hold of than, or at least easier to influence. There's a smaller pool of people voting in those elections than it is to try to affect the whole U.S. Congress and get them to change things, or or bureaucrats for that matter. That's often what it ends up being bureaucrats that are going to decide these things. So, and that's also the benefit of having more options. And I think, like we talked about earlier, I think parents are going to increasingly demand more options for their children, aside from just you send your kid to school. Maybe, with this distance learning, people are getting used to it. Well, maybe I heard about, a parent will say, I heard about, I have a friend who goes to a different school and their teacher is really good in this subject. Why can't I have them go online and get education from that teacher? And so maybe they'll want to customize their education more and pick their child's teachers more. So I could see that developing, and that gets into what you want your children learning, and what I think standards by definition are standardizing, but some kids are advanced and you don't want to hold them to this certain grade level standard, because they could be several grade levels ahead. So you want to make sure that you're getting the education that child needs, and the best people to decide that are the parents. So there is no objective sense of what's behind. There are state level standards, and certainly if you're unable to learn, you're going to miss some content and you're going to fall behind. But what's behind kind of depends on where you live and what their particular content standards and curriculum is. Private schools don't have to abide by the same content standards generally, and so if you don't like the standards in your public school, and you have the ability to get a scholarship or can afford a private school, that's another option parents have.
Right. That's good. Well, let's talk a little bit about the data and what the health professionals are saying. I read a piece that former Senator Jim DeMint wrote last week, and his claim is that school closures are actually anti-science. And he makes the point that the strange thing in this whole debate right now is that as the political debate is ramping up, the medical and scientific debate is essentially ending. Of course, you miss that point if you're only watching the mainstream and the hysteria on social media. But 3 points I wanted to bring up and ask you to help us filter through. But first, the director of the CDC has said that having the schools closed is a greater health threat to the children than having them open. Senator DeMint also brought up a New York Times survey of more than 500 epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists that found more than 70% of them would send their children to school, daycare, or camp immediately, or even later in the summer or the fall. And lastly, even the American Academy of Pediatrics agrees with this. 2 infectious disease specialists just wrote a review for the AAP's official journal, where they highlight that after 6 months of accumulating evidence and collective experience, we can see that children are far less important drivers for transmission of the virus than adults. Therefore, we must seriously consider ways that schools can remain open even during periods of increased cases, while also keeping the adults safe, yet minimizing the potentially profound adverse social, developmental, and health effects that children will continue to suffer as with schools effectively closed until a treatment or a vaccine or whatever is developed and distributed, or until we reach herd immunity. So in your calculation, how should parents be filtering all of this information as they're trying to decide what to do for their child?
I think an important point is that, that there are trade-offs, and sometimes, there's everybody tries to point to their favorite scientist to say what they want to hear. But the reality is there's trade-offs, and scientists can't make those. That has to be, that is made both by elected officials and ultimately by parents. And so there are, there's obviously we've heard some of these studies that show that it seems like children are much less likely to catch it or transmit it. We don't know everything there is to know about this virus, and so there's nothing 100% safe. There's no 100% safe option. If parents are worried about sending their kids to school, then they should have other options other than it's an all or nothing. Everyone goes to school or no one does. But certainly, no one should say that no one should go to school. And each community is going to be different. There may be some areas that are really heavily hit, and the decision locally will be that we need to close down more things. But it's certainly not fair to say that all schools should stay closed. That's a decision that's made by those schools, and it's a decision by parents whether to send them there. And I've heard from parents on both sides that they really want to send their kids to school and they want that option. And there's parents who say, I'm afraid to send my kid to school, and they should have that choice as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback from liberals on this issue of choice. And sometimes that's because of teacher unions. Just this week, the Florida Education Association sued the state of Florida over their plans to start school on time and in person. So obviously they are armed and ready to stop any kind of normalcy this year. And I also think it's so easy for these unions to prey on people's fears. So in your estimation, why is that? And how should teachers be engaging on this conversation when they're hearing different voices and the teachers union is so loud?
Any interest group has a lot of, they have influence because they're organized and they're speaking as one. And so you can have a lot of influence, whether that's a teachers union or any other kind of organization that represents a particular point of view. And the solution is to have parents or teachers who disagree with that also get together and express their points of view and be organized. I think it's not fair to say that all teachers have the same view, and it's certainly teachers' voices should be heard and not just some. And certainly parents have a huge stake in this as well, and so they should get organized and make their views heard.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note, we understand that teachers have different views in that a lot of them are concerned over the virus, but a lot of them are also concerned over the well-being of their students. Yeah. And that's a hard balance. There's a lot of hard decisions to be made in that. And so we really just want to encourage teachers to also work with the parents and have more of a comprehensive message on the local level. And I think that's how a lot of these grassroots movements begin, is when people start coming together and having these conversations and figuring out what's best for families in their communities.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This has been such a good conversation, James, and I loved how you kept reiterating the point that these should be parent-led decisions made by the communities, the localities, and the state. And we shouldn't be looking to the federal government or to Congress or the president, whatever that looks like. We shouldn't be looking that way for these decisions to be made. We should be making them ourselves. So where can our listeners go to get the latest information on what the Senate's working on, or to follow Senator Grassley and you? How can they dive deeper into this issue?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's, you can always go to the website of grassley.senate.gov or your own senator's website. It's sometimes hard to find. The media picks up what they want to pick up, and there's often a lot of things put out there that you don't see. So I would go right to the website of elected officials and see what they're saying and the information they're putting out, and you can make up your own mind based off of that. Yeah. There's it's also good to look at lots of different news sources and not just pick one, because they don't. It's hard to get the full picture from that. But and I certainly think Eagle Forum does a good job of organizing and getting information out to your members. So
yeah. Well, and that's one thing I wanted to encourage our listeners to do. Find the Eagle Forum in your state or education advocates in your state that are working on these issues and see how you can get involved, because this pandemic has only highlighted and risen to the surface these issues that we've been working on for decades. So get involved, because your voice needs to be heard.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James, for catching us up on the education efforts on Capitol Hill. If you are listening to this episode, please share and give us a rating. You can engage with us in this conversation on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. From your house to the State House to the White House, this is Engage with Eagle Forum.